In some ways, that song, Where the Soul of Man Never Dies, fits what we're going to be talking about this evening, that we are surrounded by a promise that is testified to by so many witnesses that God is faithful and that He has a place prepared for us, and that there are promises that we hold to even today that were made as far back as antiquity that still guide our lives. And so I've mentioned this morning as we were talking about in the sermon all, and how it is that the grace of God is not just all encompassing, it is all changing. We owe to it our entire lives. That it was really sort of a setup, or not a setup, but it was meant to work in tandem with tonight's lesson, which is really focused on the end of Hebrews chapter 11. You know, that part of Hebrews 11 we never talk about. We always kind of go down through about verse 28, where you sort of get to the end of Moses there, and then you kind of just fast forward through the end of Hebrews 11. Well, tonight we're going to be talking about the last part of Hebrews 11, but we're going to start by talking about Hebrews chapter 12, beginning in verse 1, where it says, "Therefore, since we have so great a cloud of witnesses, surrounding us, let us also lay aside every encumbrance and the sin which so easily entangles us, and let us run with endurance the race set before us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God." Have you ever thought about that idea of there being a cloud of witnesses that surround us? What does that mean? I heard somebody say once, does that mean everybody's up in heaven just sort of looking down on us and watching? That's not what it is. It's not saying the cloud is witnessing us, but rather the cloud of people that gives a testimony to us. That's the idea here, is that whoever this cloud of witnesses is, they are giving a testimony to us that is an important testimony. And I've taught this before in other congregations where I focused on the front half of Hebrews 11 and thought about basically how cool is the idea that Moses is there testifying to you of God's faithfulness, and Abraham and Isaac and Enoch and Abel are there testifying, and Noah are there testifying about God's faithfulness in service of your faith today. And that's really sort of the upshot of that whole verse, is that the reason why you have these great Bible stories, the reason why we teach kids about Noah's faithfulness, and the reason why we teach them about Cain and Abel, and the reason why we teach them about the faith of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph, and the reason why we teach them to sing Dare to Stand Like Joshua, and teach them about Moses and David and all of these people, is there is not only something imitatable about their faith, but their faith is in fact a testimony of God's faithfulness. So all those people that we just named, right, that we sing the Bible class songs about, faithful Noah built an ark just like God told him to, right? Or we'll talk about Daniel in the lion's den, or we'll talk about Moses parting the Red Sea. Do you know why that story is in your Bible? Well, it's there in part because it serves the narrative of how God brought Jesus into the world. But the other part that it serves is it is there to serve your faith. And that should immediately sort of reframe the way that we think about the Bible. But the interesting thing about this is the nearest people in Hebrews 11 that this cloud of witness statement is connected to is not Abel and Enoch and Moses and Noah and Abraham, but rather it's these people. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell down, and they had been encircled for 7 days. And by faith, Rahab the harlot did not perish along with those who were disobedient after she had welcomed the spies in peace. And what more shall I say? For time will fail me if I tell of Gideon and Barak and Samson and Jephthah, of David and Samuel and the prophets, who by faith conquered kingdoms, performed acts of righteousness, obtained promises. Boy, that ought to be inspirational to our faith. Shut the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, from weakness were made strong, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. Women received back their dead by resurrection, and others were tortured, not accepting their release, so that they might obtain a better resurrection. And others experienced mockings and scourgings, yes, also chains and imprisonment. I'm going to tell you, the fact that we're talking about people suffering and obtaining a better resurrection means that some of these witnesses that the Hebrew writer is talking about are New Testament figures. And they were stoned. And they were sawn in two. They were tempted. They were put to death with the sword. They went about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute and afflicted, ill-treated. And this is the verse that I want you to underline in your mind or in your Bible. Men of whom the world was not worthy. I want you to think about that for a second. The men of whom the world was not worthy. What are we learning about these people here? That the people around them that could have learned from them and been inspired by them, that could have been corrected by them. You remember King Darius and Daniel and how his faith was corrected by Daniel, and even Nebuchadnezzar's faith was corrected by Daniel and Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah at times. I mean, he still got a little uppity and had to be brought down, but he learned some lessons, didn't he? But what we see here is that for all the people who were around people of faith and were inspired and turned to God, or at least made some sort of turn in that direction, there were hundreds, if not thousands, if not millions, who did not. And it's almost as if the Spirit is testifying through the Hebrew writer, the world just didn't deserve that example. Or maybe what it's saying is that God wouldn't trade all the people in the world who aren't faithful for those few who we don't even know their name who are. They're worthy in His mind. That was the testimony right earlier, is that God was pleased to be called their God. That's what the Hebrew writer says. He was pleased that they were His people. Well, they wander in deserts and mountains and caves and holes in the ground. And all these having gained approval through their faith, which that should tell us something about faith being more than just belief, right? They gained approval through their faith. Well, what were they doing? They were trusting God and doing what God said. All these having gained approval through their faith did not receive what was promised, because God had provided something better for us, so that apart from us, they would not be made perfect. So all of these are not strangers to us. They didn't receive a promise that we can't receive, and the Old Testament figures died looking over to that promise. But they're there to remind us, not that their faith is not attainable. I think sometimes that's how we think about Moses. Man, I'd love to have faith like Moses. Man, I'd love to have faith like Abraham, right? They're not there as paragons of faith saying, look how high this person's faith is. You can never attain it. It is there to say, you can, you will, and you must attain that kind of faith. And you know what this tells me? Tells me that in that statement that the world is not worthy is that these are not the also-rans. That's somehow we kind of think of it. These are like the participation faithful of God, right? They get the little green ribbon that they used to give out at field day. These are not the also-rans. These are the heroes of faith. I know, I got lots of green participation ribbons. Good try. Good try, buddy. You didn't run backwards. These are the real heroes. Not because it's not diminishing Moses or Abraham in any kind of way, but these are the heroes of faith. They trusted God to the point of death and beyond. They trusted God so that they gave up everything that they had in this world when it was taken from them or by choice to serve God. And what that tells me is that the number of God's people is really greater than we know. It's easy to feel like we're just a tiny little raft in the middle of a big ocean, doesn't it? And I think that's sort of the Hebrew writer's point here, is that's not really the case when you look at all time. Oh, it's still not as big as all the people that are there, but there's a whole lot. And it's a little bit like maybe Elijah was in 1 Kings 19. He's got his complaint after the showdown with the prophets of Baal. Remember that? The Lord proved that he was God, and the people were supposed to all turn to him, and instead they were still afraid of Jezebel, and Jezebel still threatening to kill Elijah. And this is a conclusion he comes to. He says, I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the sons of Israel have forsaken your covenant, torn down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword, and I alone am left. And they seek my life to take it away. Elijah's throwing a little bit of a pity party for himself here, and I think I probably would too at this point. So he said, this is the Lord speaking, go forth and stand on the mountain before the Lord. And behold, the Lord was passing by, and a great and strong wind was rending the mountains and breaking the pieces of the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, the earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a gentle blowing. And when Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in the mantle and went out and stood in the entrance of the cave. And behold, a voice came to him and said, what are you doing here, Elijah? And then he said, I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the sons of Israel have forsaken the covenant, torn down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword, and I alone am left, and they seek my life to take it away. And the Lord said to him, go, return your way to the wilderness of Damascus, and when you have arrived, anoint Hazael king over Aram, and Jehu the son of Nishma. You shall anoint him king over Israel, and Elisha the son of Shaphat of Abel-Meholah, and you shall anoint a prophet in your place. And it shall come about, that the one who escapes from the sword of Hazael, Jehu shall put to death, and the one who escapes from the sword of Jehu, Elisha shall put to death. And yet I leave 7,000 in Israel, all the knees that have not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him. Elijah got the feeling like, maybe what's the point of faith? God, just kill me now. Let me die in the wilderness. And I've used this analogy before. It was actually Benjamin Lee that came up with it, that God first showed Elijah he needed a nap, a snack, and a job. And I love that. I will forever talk about that in 1 Kings 19. But I want you to see what he said there. He says, Elijah, get up. You've got work to do, and you are not as alone as you think you are. There are 7,000 people in Israel whose knee has never touched the ground before Baal. And they need you to do the work that I'm telling you to do. Brothers and sisters, it's easy in this world to think maybe sometimes, what's the point? It's just going from bad to worse, right? Morality is going out the window. We talked a little bit about that in Bible class this morning, the last days and the things that happen in the last days that Paul was telling Timothy would occur. And it's not the things that you hear about in the secular world, great wars and kingdoms coming down and Jesus reigning on the earth. That's not what he talks about the last days. He says the last days people are going to get tired of hearing the truth. They're going to go from bad to worse. They're going to do it because they love money, they're selfish, they're ignorant, and they know they're ignorant and don't want to change that. And they're hard-hearted. But he tells Timothy, he says, you know what? Don't get discouraged. Be ready in season and out of season to do the work of the evangelist and fulfill your ministry. That's what Elijah was in. He was in a bad season. He was in a place where he felt like the only one. We can be in places where we feel like the only one, and this is why coming together and being together is so important. Because when I come together on a Sunday, there's sometimes as many as 120 people who do not bow the knee to what the rest of the world's bowing the knee to. And that makes faith just a little bit easier. And I know where my parents worship, there's 400. And I know where my buddy Brent preaches, there's 200 or 300. I know that you can go up to Campbell Road in Dallas, there's almost 600 people there. We're putting here over 3,000 people, just adding those together, right? They're not bowing the knee to the world. We need to realize we're not alone. But not only are we not alone because they are with us, more importantly, we are not alone because God is with us. That's where Daniel comes into this. And I think this is specifically why the stopping of the mouths of lions might have been mentioned. It says in Daniel 6 and verse 1 that it seemed good to Darius to appoint 120 satraps over the kingdom, and they would be in charge of the whole kingdom, and over 3 commissioners, of whom Daniel was one. And these satraps might be accountable to them, and that the king might not suffer loss. Then this Daniel began distinguishing himself among the commissioners. I wonder why. Probably for the same reasons that he'd always distinguished himself, right? And the satraps, because he possessed an extraordinary spirit, and the king planned to appoint him over the entire kingdom. And then the commissioners and the satraps began trying to find a ground of accusation against Daniel in regard to the government affairs, but they could find no ground of accusation or evidence of corruption inasmuch as he was faithful, and no negligence or corruption was to be found in him. Then these men said, "We will not find any ground of accusation against Daniel unless we find it against him with regard to the law of his God." Basically, we're going to have to do something that drives a wedge between Daniel and his God if we're going to make an accusation against him. Then these commissioners and satraps came by agreement to the king and spoke to him as follows. It amazes me. There's 120 satraps and 2 other commissioners. 122 people hated Daniel so much that they were willing to do this. I'm going to tell you, in this environment, we don't know where Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah are at this point. Daniel is alone. There's not 7,000 people in the court of Darius that aren't bowing the knee to what they're about to do. And they came by agreement to the king and spoke to him as follows. The king Darius live forever. And all the commissioners of the kingdom, the prefects and the satraps, the high officials and the governors have consulted together. And if it was really that big, it's a whole lot bigger than 122 people. That the king should establish a statute and enforce an injunction that anyone who makes a petition to any god or man beside you, O king, for 30 days shall be cast into the lion's den. I want to tell you, the federal government of Babylon, of Persia, just declared war on Daniel. That's a scary situation, isn't it? How do you think Daniel's going to handle this? Now, O king, establish the injunction and sign the document so that it may be changed according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which may not be revoked. Therefore, King Darius signed the document. That is the injunction. How do you think Daniel handled this? Do you think he went to Darius with a big old placard that said, "Pray how I want"? Do you think he took a little Instagram photo and said, hashtag no lion's den for me? You think he went and mouthed about the king about how stupid and foolish he was? Obviously being played by these people. No. This is what Daniel did. Now, when Daniel knew that the document was signed, he entered his house. Now, in the roof chamber, he had windows open toward Jerusalem. And he continued kneeling on his knees 3 times a day, praying and giving thanks before his God, as he had been doing previously. This is the original take it to the Lord in prayer. Daniel didn't need 7,000 prophets beside him because he knew his God was with him. Then these men came by agreement and found Daniel making petition and supplication before his God. And then they approached and spoke before the king about the king's injunction. Did you not sign this injunction that any man who makes a petition to any god or man besides you, O king, for 30 days is to be cast into the lion's den? And the king replied, the statement is true according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which may not be revoked. Then they answered and spoke before the king, Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, O king, or to the injunction which you signed, but keeps making his petition 3 times a day. Then as soon as the king heard the statement, he was deeply distressed and set his mind to delivering Daniel, and even until sunset he kept exerting himself to rescue him. Then these men came by agreement. That's another thing Daniel didn't do. He didn't say, hey, Darius, we're kind of buddies here and you're getting fooled. You're getting played here. How about you give me a little pass? King couldn't do that. He tried. That was the king's solution to the problem, wasn't it? Then these men came by agreement to the king and said to the king, recognize, O king, that it is a law of the Medes and the Persians that no injunction or statute which the king establishes may be changed. Then the king gave orders, and Daniel was brought and cast into the lion's den. And the king spoke and said, Daniel, your God, whom you constantly serve, will himself deliver you. I don't know if that's certainty or a wish on Darius' part, but he certainly is right about it. A stone was brought and laid over the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the signet rings of the nobles, so that nothing would be changed in regard to Daniel. And then the king went off to the palace and spent the night fasting, and no entertainment was brought before him, and his sleep fled from him. Well, that didn't end where it was supposed to. Of course, we know how that story ends, right? King goes out the next morning and calls to Daniel and wants to know, has his God delivered him? Daniel tells him what? The angel of the Lord came and stopped the mouths of the lions. But the first thing he said to Darius was, don't worry. Not here's how wrong you are, here's how foolish you were. I'm here. I'm going to tell you, sometimes when our faith speaks in quiet, simple, declarative statements, not the loud, boisterous rhetoric of the world, but just simple, I know my God and he will deliver me. Our faith speaks more volumes than all the sermons that will ever be preached. What did Darius do after that? Do you remember? Not just he caused the satraps to be thrown in with the lions and get their just desserts, but he issued a decree that there was no God like Daniel's. And what that tells me is that the endurance of these people is evidence of God's faithfulness. You don't become a person that's even the people that were described in Hebrews 12 that was willing to accept death because you believe in a better resurrection and a better promise to come, because you won't renounce your faith in God. You don't come to that conclusion unless you have seen God's faithfulness for yourself. That's why these are witnesses. That's what they're trying to tell us. They're trying to tell us that the endurance that God is asking for in Hebrews 12, that we lay aside every sin and that the weight that entangles us, and that we run with endurance the race that is set before us. What they're trying to tell us is God's promises are worthy. What was Daniel's promise? One day the remnant was going to go back to Jerusalem, right? He wasn't going to live to see that. But do you think maybe Daniel was sort of basing his faith on that promise? I think he probably was. The reason why I say that is because What's he praying toward? Where's his heart? We'll sing a song sometimes, "This world is not my home, I'm just passing through. My treasures are laid up somewhere beyond the blue. The angels beckon me from heaven's open door, and I can't feel at home in this world anymore." Do we mean that? I think Daniel meant it. I think that's why he went to the roof and bent the knee toward Jerusalem, and he's focusing his prayer in that direction. The only reason for that to be the case is that to him is still the place where God's people meet God. And there was a promise that he was going to bring them out of this captivity. Before they ever went into captivity, God was promising to bring them back. So what if he didn't live to see it? He was going to serve it. You know, I don't know very many people, brethren, in my lifetime who have not said, I think, Jesus is coming soon. I don't know very many people. My grandparents, before they died, both thought that he'd probably come in their lifetime. That's just the way of the world, right? Just going from bad to worse. It's easy to think that to the degree that we forget that the promises of God remain. And that God, as Peter says in 2 Peter chapter 3, is not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance. And maybe the question that we should ask is our faith serving the cause of bringing others to repentance? It certainly did for Daniel. It certainly did for Elijah, because, Elijah went and appointed the guy Elisha that really was going to do a lot of work, wasn't he? But what were they doing? They were both preparing Israel to go into captivity, to go away, reminding them that they were not what they should have been. Did that mean that God had forgotten his promises? No. Because the promises of God, thankfully, are bigger than the faithfulness of the people that look to them. I'm really glad about that, aren't you? Promises of God allow me to endure even at times when my faith hasn't been what it should have been. Because you see, what the promises of God are really trying to get us to do, and what these witnesses are really testifying to us, is not just stay with God in difficult circumstances like lions' dens. What they're trying to tell us is lay aside the thing that gets between you and God. That's the testimony. For Abraham, it was the Ur of the Chaldees. For Moses, it was being the first guy to ever say it was going to rain and that we need to build an ark. But every one of these figures had to make a choice between the world around them and what God had promised. And brothers and sisters, it takes just as much faith to serve God in ordinary times as it does extraordinary times. It takes just as much faith for our kids to go into the school every day, Monday through Friday, being inundated and indoctrinated with all the things that are there, and hold on to their God in the face of, some cases, extreme verbal persecution. And yet they come home every day with their faith intact and growing. Sometimes we just have to learn to let go of the world, because that world is not serving our faith. This place is never going to help us be better Christians, more like Jesus, more attuned to the promises of God. And that's why we have these stories. Because we need to see that men, not just like Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Moses and Noah and Abel and Enoch, could move with godly fear. But everyday people just like you and me, whose names we don't even know, are just as much the heroes of faith as they are. Because they chose God and His promises over everything this world had to offer. And brothers and sisters, as this world more and more diverges away from God's plan, His way, and His walk, we're having to ask that a lot more of the younger generations than we have ever before. To make those choices younger, to be more faithful to them, and we need to help them embrace that struggle. Because you see, the real head fake to all of this is you are part of someone's cloud of witnesses. Your faith is either going to speak to the faithfulness of God, the worthiness of His promise, that we rise by bending our knee to Him, or it's going to speak against that. And brothers and sisters, I may never know the names of the people that were put to death by sword or drawn or cut in half or didn't accept the release of their body. I may never know the names of the women who received back their dead. I may never know anyone other than Daniel who stopped the mouths of the lions or had the mouths of the lions stopped for them. But I can be instrumental in the faith of someone watching me the same way they have been instrumental in developing my faith. And that's really what the end of Hebrews 11 is all about. Why do we have these people? Because we need to stand and be witnessed to. And as we consider that, we need to stop and ask ourselves, what is our testimony about God? So what is your testimony about God? Is it like Daniel's, that I'll keep doing it God's way regardless of the cost, regardless of what the world will say? Is it like the faith of Elijah that maybe hits a weak spot but then rises again because it trusts God and it's inspired by its brethren? Is it still speaking that I will lay aside the weight and the sin because I know that's the only way to Jesus? Your faith is saying something tonight. And if you don't know what that something is, we need to stop and take account of what it's saying. Do you owe some duty to God? Is your soul what it ought to be? If it's not, come forward confessing as we stand and sing.